Hello, welcome to my show. I am here alone today. So we're going to have a whole lot of fun because I've got stuff to talk about. I want to find out if you have stuff to talk about. Got to put my glasses on because you can't be on the internet without your glasses. All right. It's Thursday, as we normally do here every week. In case you didn't know, this is a show that turns into a podcast sometimes. We've actually got some new stuff coming this year. We're working on expanding our video repertoire, and these Q&As might become clips, and there might be plans for some new YouTube video uploads, and it's just plans, all kinds of plans. I am also finishing up a little bit of a cough drop thing for sore throats and whatnot. So slippery elm. That's what I'm sucking on right now. So apologies for that. All right, let's get into it. Hello, everyone in chat. I see Eric. I see Todd. Nubuo. I don't know how to say that. Nubuo? Nubu? I'm going to say Nubu. Never known how to pronounce that all this time. Martin's here. Hello. Always coming out from the other Netherlands. MW's back. It's a real Clark Kent moment. You think I'm like a substitute? I show up. Hey, I don't know who I am. I don't actually need these for computer work, but I'm just so used to wearing them. They're always on. All right. This week's newsletter, we're going to get into it. I talked about some things, feeling overwhelmed with all the updates, all the things happening in CNCF. We're going to get into that. But first, if you didn't know, I normally have a co-host. Normal's off this week. He's actually having fun at an amusement park. Yay, Disney. But the rest of us are stuck here online. And in case you didn't know, whenever we have guests, which we have a lot of guests coming up, if you want, I can tell you some of the guests we have planned. Those guests turn into a podcast. That's what happens. And then we have a newsletter. That's every week. And this week's newsletter, which we're going to get into, was trying to keep up with all the CNCF project releases. Even just the ones I care about is actually so much work. Trying to figure out all the new things in Docker and Kubernetes core releases and things like Traffic 3.0 coming out. So we're going to get into that. And I'm curious about your strategies other than listening to this fine show. I mean, we're not really about news here. So this is like probably not your number one news podcast or anything like that. But we have podcasts, we have newsletter. We also have a wonderful Discord server over here. People are every day figuring out DevOps stuff inside the server. So that's a lot of fun. Come join us. Come join us. The link is right there, discord.gg. Oh, Eric's going to Orlando. Okay. Wait, are we having a DevOps meetup in Orlando? Is that what needs to happen? The Tron ride. There's a new Tron ride? Why is it so small? What's happening here? Hold on. Why was that so small? And what's happening? We're going to fix this. There we go. That's a little better. Let's see if we can shrink that down. Okay. Sorry about technical difficulties. All right. Let's talk about stuff that we're going to talk about in this show. Like, here's a summary. I want to talk about strategies that you have, and I will share my strategies for how do I stay up with all the new stuff. Now that RSS feeds and RSS readers are not gone, they're just not popular. And sometimes it's hard to find the RSS link for a particular blog. And not all blogs have them because not everything is updated in a blog. A lot of software projects don't even have a blog. Or if that blog is there, it's mixed with a whole bunch of other stuff that's not just software releases. So blogs can't always be the right place. And we're going to get into that. Like, obviously, there's GitHub release features, and I use Google Alerts for things, and maybe particular Twitter accounts that I make sure I'm updated on. But I'm curious about how you all do it. And if you just say, I sign up for every newsletter and I read them all, which is insane, like every possible newsletter. I have a lot of newsletters that I sign up for and I read none of them. I mean, who's got the time? Who's got the time? So we're going to get into that. But first, let me just tell you who's showing up on the show here soon. Next week, AWS Graviton. So if you don't know what Graviton is, it's essentially AWS making their own chips. And these are like the Apple Silicon chips. These are ARM chips. And they're on Gen 3, maybe. I'm not sure if Gen 4 is out yet. But I have increasingly become a fan. I was a fan of the first ones. The first gen wasn't quite... It was kind of like equal performance cost to an Intel. But you could kind of see the future of, okay, these things are going to be awesome if they make them even faster. And then they did. And then the second gen, some cost savings was possible if you ran your stuff on ARM. And then the third gen really ramped it up to where they're claiming, over 50% cost savings if you move your workloads to ARM. And strangely, I don't see a lot of people doing it. Like, I still work with people, and when I talk to clients, they're not thinking about cost savings in terms of switching their platform, switching their architecture. And so, Nirmal hooked us up. We've got Michael Fisher coming on the show from AWS Graviton. No relation. We actually spell our last names differently. So that's next week. Then we're going to have Nate from Continue.dev, which is AI for local dev. Basically, it's kind of like the open source, or I'm not exactly sure how they're spinning it, but it's another Copilot type of tool. So Continue.dev, that's in a couple of weeks. We're going to have another CNDO, Cloud Native DevOps. That's what we call these things around here. We're going to have another one of those this month. And then next month, at the very end of this month, actually, we're going to have Kyle on talking from Docker Slim. You may have heard of Docker Slim. It's now been renamed. In fact, I don't even remember. Anonymous Plane, I think, is the name of his company now. So we're gonna dig into the name changes and the new features and why you might take another look at the Slim project. So a lot of us, it's not new. A lot of us have tried it over the years, used it over the years for various things, but it's not done. And Kyle's working hard on it. So I'm excited to get an update from him. We touched base briefly at KubeCon. We just didn't get a chance to really dig into a lot of the details. What else? We've got ML Ops coming on the show. We got Maria coming in from the ML Ops. I think she does a podcast, and I need to learn my machine learning operations. I need pros to come in and talk about the nuances and the differences. If you're someone who's not traditionally in ML Ops, and maybe you're a Kubernetes container person, and now you have to run these machine learning workloads for AI, you've got some catching up to do. So the intent of that show, that's going to be in June, and we're going to basically help sort of traditional DevOps people like myself get into the ML Ops game and what we need to care about that's maybe a little different than before. So that's next month. Again, there's like 5 or 6 other people we're working on for the show. It's going to be exciting. But a lot of those will turn into a podcast. So if you don't get to listen to it here, just go to, what's the website? That website over there. Go to the podcast and check it out. Is ML Ops the new thing? What is this with this little thingy? Why is it little? That's a good question. Srinath, sorry if I mispronounced that. MLOps is not new, but it is new for a lot of us that didn't have to care about machine learning or large workloads like that are maybe have some unique problems around just the size of the container images, GPU requirements, stuff like that we maybe didn't have to worry about as traditional DevOps people. And there were dedicated teams and dedicated groups in companies that specialize in ML and AI workloads. And now suddenly we all have to care. So it's not that it's a new thing. I think it's just more like a lot of us suddenly have to care that didn't have to care. Eric's actually going just for your daughter's cheer competition. Okay, well, hey, whatever excuses you got to make up, man. I mean, adults are allowed to go to amusement parks too. Okay, like it's okay. Nobody's going to judge you. Conrad, what's up? Coming in from Palo Alto. Yeah, so yeah, that's a great question on is ML Ops new? That it is not. And that's why we're bringing on some of those people this year specifically, because I know a lot of us are now having to suddenly care. We just had Olama on the show talking about running AI workloads locally, and graph databases and large images that might have an entire Hugging Face large language model in it. Like these are all things that we maybe are consumers of, but then when you become responsible for running them, things change. And so that's, yeah. The big question at the moment is, are we going from VMware VMs to containers or VMware VMs to Kubernetes VMs? That is a big question. So interestingly enough, I had related to this whole VMware thing, what does everyone still think about OpenStack? Like, we don't really talk about it much anymore, but it's still around. And if people are going to avoid VMware, what are they replacing VMware with? Specifically in the data center. Now, I mean, there's obviously people that have used some VMware tooling in the enterprise, in the cloud. I would think that is not as popular as people that still have traditional data centers, which are a lot of us. We're still around, and that we're using VMware there. What are people switching to? I'm very curious, because VMware had a quite wide set of functionality and tooling. So there's a lot there that if you were truly trying to get off of VMware, you would have to do a lot of work. So I'm actually curious, and I talked to a friend of mine who's running a new startup called Open Metal that is basically cloud-hosted OpenStack. And we had a long conversation the other night. It was quite informative. I've not kept up with the projects since Docker and Kubernetes came out, and I'm curious what other people think. They're basically bullish and are betting that people want their own cloud provided for them in a sort of open source way that you can then move it from a cloud physically to your own data center and still operate your own private cloud. So let's check it out. We don't know what we're going to do yet. We might do some videos. We might do have them as guests on the show. But let me know if you've heard about Open Metal, if you're curious about OpenStack and what that looks like today versus 10 years ago. Because I don't really hang out with that group, but I'm very curious about it. I mean, if you're an operator, you are concerned about operator open source software, and that is definitely one of them. So I am curious. I've been so focused on containers that I've kind of ignored the underlying pieces below that. And I'm curious what people think. Azure Stack HCI. I don't know what that is. Nutanix. Yeah. That might be a thing that people choose. And there's a question mark there. Does that mean that you're just curious or you don't know? Like, are you doing that? Is that what you're doing? Yeah, loved OpenStack about 10 years ago. I mean, and there's a lot of people that did. And I'm just curious. I mean, we can... I'm not really so curious about the story of what happened to the project, because there's lots of lore around, the demise. But it's still around. It still exists. It still gets updates. So we had a great conversation for hours at a local beer establishment the other night. So that was a good time. Thanks, Yuri, if you watched this video. Thanks for hanging out. It was a lot of fun. So yeah, we haven't had a show about VMware. But let me pull this up. All right. So the one topic that I want to talk about, again, if you got questions, if you got things we want to talk about, throw them in chat. But I sent out a newsletter last night, and it was based on some frustrations I've had with my own time lately. We all get busy. We all have times where we're, just too much going on. We can't keep up. And that has been me for the last couple of months. KubeCon Paris, some trips to see family, lots of travel lately. And I'm really feeling out of date. Well, actually, if we scroll down, I just kind of listed some of the major things that have happened in 2024 that I have not fully grokked. I've not fully tested, understood all the functionality and feature changes. One of those is the Docker Engine v26 came out. Not a huge amount of updates there. It was, in my opinion, it's sort of a minor release. Maybe volume subpath mounts are really important for some people. That was a big highlight. Swarm, basically IPv6 by default in a lot of cases inside of a Swarm or Docker networking, and then Swarm just supporting IPv6 at all was a big deal. And then they're continuing to change the Docker engine to rely more on Containerd's image store. This has been a multi-year process, and we're now finally getting some improvements in how we manage images for multi-platform or multi-architecture. That's always been tricky. And if you are someone who builds an image for multi-platform like I do, and you sometimes maybe want to run both the image that's native for your machine and an image that's maybe going through QEMU for emulation, that gets a little tricky because it doesn't actually show you the architectures inside of Docker images list. And so they're slowly improving that over time. There's a series of PRs I think that are going to be needed. But that was the big deal there. We've got Compose, which had 4 releases in the last 6 months, a lot. And there's new commands. There's a whole lot of new options. There's new features like mutagen sync. We could go into that. Traffic 3.0 came out I think it was last week, which is a big deal. There's lots of significant new features. They've been working on that for years. And it now supports WebAssembly, which I think that just means WebAssembly for middleware, but I don't actually know. So I haven't actually dove into this. They're going to have a meeting at Traffic for the public. I think if you're on their email newsletter, you'll see it. They're going to have one, I think, in the next week or two. And then we're setting up for Traffic to be on this show. We're going to have the founder on the show. We're going to go through some of these new features. Hopefully we'll get a demo or two of what they mean. But there's now OpenTelemetry support, so probably some of the metrics features have changed to be more OpenTelemetry capable. Gateway API, which Gateway API came out of beta about 6 months ago. I think it was around KubeCon North America 2023 timeframe. But Gateway API is exciting, and they're now going to support that. HTTP3, Spiffy, Tailscale, which, I'm excited about Tailscale. I use it a lot when I travel. And then WAF. So that's exciting too. I actually have friends that have a WAF startup. So I think they were working with Traffic, and I'm excited to dig into that to see what they've done for adding web application firewalls to the Traffic middleware. And then you have, of course, Kubernetes updates. You have Argo releasing 1.10, which has application set templates, which I'm interested in. There's actually, honestly, there's at least a dozen new features that you might be affected by in Argo. And then something that we haven't actually talked about for a while. Last year, I let you know in the podcast, in the newsletter, I let you know about major changes coming to the OCI distribution. That's registry. That's any place you get your images and other things from a Docker image registry or a container image registry. That all conforms to the OCI distribution spec. And then we have the image spec for the images themselves. And they all got a minor update, but it's a major one because it's really the first update we've had since 2017 when this stuff was all released as out of beta 1.0, and now we finally have 1.1 as of the beginning of this year. And we're starting to see tooling and things change. Even the runtime got updated, I think, to like 1.2 or something. It only has a minor change in it that's affected by this stuff, but this is exciting because what we're going to be getting is official artifact support. There's a couple other major little things, like there's an additional new compression algorithm that you can use that's a little bit better, more efficient. And then the refers API, which is a whole new part of the API, which is a part of this artifact support. But what you're going to be seeing with OCI now is your registries are going to start supporting all sorts of new file types that allow you to have a single, basically, artifact store called a registry. And that artifact store will store way more than just your container images. We've already been seeing that happening for the last like 5 years, but we're now getting official support in the spec so that all the tools, instead of being sort of hacky workarounds or trying to figure out ways to use the existing feature sets to work for them, we're now going to get a very consistent pattern that the tooling can all now work together so that we don't end up with like a single tool storing a single file type in a registry, but then you can't use another tool with that file type, and you can't even see the file in the registry because the registry doesn't officially support it. Like, that was the kind of problems we were having before. And now we're hopefully going to get it to where all your registries will support all these common file types. We're talking SBOMs, we're talking annotations. Sorry for the jet noise. I don't know if you can hear that. We're talking a lot of different stuff. So if you're curious about that, if that piques your interest, then I will recommend you go back to my podcast, and I'm going to give you a link in the case this is stuff just you're curious about and you haven't heard about it, what's coming. I'm going to give you one of my older podcasts from December of last year, actually, which was based upon some newsletters that I did last summer. Gosh, almost a year ago. And this is literally like 5 or 7 years in the making. Like, this stuff has, if you go look at the diff of, let's just go look at a diff real quick. If we go look at the 1.1, if you want to see how long this stuff has been in the works, this is open source, people. Like, if you want to talk about how long this stuff has been in the works, I'm actually going to jump over to, let's see. Let's go over here. Full change set. So, let's see. Actually, this is not the one. So this one goes all the way back to 2021. 214 commits. But if we go to the image spec, it's kind of crazy, actually. And we go to releases, and we do the full change set. This is 331 commits going all the way back to 2017 is how much work and time it took to put together this minor update to image spec. That is not me complaining. That is me saying this is what it takes to create an industry-wide common specification. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes more than a few years to get everyone to agree on a common set of features. And if you sort of watch this roller coaster happen, things moved forward and then kind of stepped back a little bit because maybe ideas needed to bake a little bit more throughout the teams. And there's more than one team involved with throwing in their their ideas into the ring of sorts. So we're going to do a show about this. I'm not sure exactly if it's going to be a live show. Maybe we'll put together a video. I've got some friends that are going to come in and give me some smarts. Give me some smarts on the stuff that's going on here. So in case you're curious, go check out that podcast that I sent, and then then you'll know. So that's just the things that I really, really care about, right? These are just like the top 6 projects that I care about. And that's a lot, I think, for the last 5 months of updates. And I have a hard time keeping up. So I'm curious, what are your strategies for keeping up with open source projects, assuming that you manage or follow more than one tool? Because most of us, if you're involved in anything with DevOps, you have your local tooling, you have server tooling, you have CI tooling, you have stuff everywhere, and it's a lot. And even if you're someone who tries to stay focused or narrow in a particular segment of the software lifecycle. It's still a lot. Even if you're not someone who cares about all the latest attempts at new projects and new ways to redo things, and these are just the tried and true projects that I've been following for at least 4 or 5 years on most of these. Some of them 7 or 8 years, 10 years, and I'm just trying to keep my core knowledge up to date, and it can be tricky. It can be hard. So I threw in this blog some of my general strategies for how I get updates when I'm not reading every blog article on a website, right? Like obviously some of you just might subscribe to all the newsletters, but I find that way too overwhelming. I find it for certain projects that are, especially when they're commercial products, that's great. Maybe I'll do that if I'm really into that. Something like traffic, I might actually sign up for their newsletter. But Kubernetes doesn't really have a newsletter. Like everybody talks about it, and every blog is going to mention the releases. And then you have the Kubernetes blog, which is also great. Fantastic blog. But there's a lot. Like 1 out of 50 posts is going to be about a new release of Kubernetes. So how do you just learn about releases and what's changed in a new version? That's really the big question here. So I have 3 general things that I combine. There's actually a 4th one here, but I have 3 that I combine to try to grok what's changing. And I'm going to walk through them. So do I use a feed aggregator like Feedly? I honestly used to. I used Feedly for a decade or more, especially after Google got rid of Google Reader or whatever it was called. But I don't anymore because blogs aren't usually the best place to learn about releases. Unless you can find a blog or a subset, like maybe a category or a tag of a blog that you can filter the URL on to only show you release updates, right? So for example, like the Kubernetes blog, if you go to the Kubernetes blog, only about 1 out of 25, 1 out of 50 posts is going to be about a new version of Kubernetes. A lot of them might be about one feature in that release or about just something that they're working on in alpha or beta, something like that. And I really, for example, in like Kubernetes land, I really only concern myself with stable features. Like I might read through new beta features or new alpha features very quickly, but I'm not really going to test them or care about them until they're stable because I know that none of my clients are really going to do anything with them. And we can't really plan for those because a lot of times features, if you watch the release cycle of Kubernetes, a lot of features will be, they'll attempt to go into release. And then when they do the code freeze actually will cause a lot of those features to not get included. So things that might have, you would have thought been alpha in that release or planned to be alpha in that release or beta may not make it because of timing. So you just don't really know for certain until things are actually released and stable with a Kubernetes release, whether or not that feature is going to make it. And in case you're curious about this, by the way, the Google Kubernetes podcast, a great podcast, by the way, just recently, they had Kat on. Thank you, Kat Cosgrove, for having such a great episode. I need to reach out on Twitter and tell you it was fantastic. So this is a great episode recently where they had a release manager on that talked about the process of releasing and then a little bit about Kubernetes 1.30, but also what changes in the process of releasing and what some of the things that are going on behind the scenes of releasing a major version of an open source project as big as Kubernetes. So in case you're curious about all of that in the background, it's great if you're someone who wants to get involved, but if you really are just curious about what it takes, and I certainly learned a lot from Kat in this episode, so I recommend that. But this is a great podcast in general. If you just listen to the first 10 minutes, because it comes out every week, if you listen to the first 10 minutes, you tend to get a nice update on just Kubernetes projects. I'm not actually sure if it's just project. It might also include members of the CNCF. Now, of course, this is very Kubernetes specific, but then again, so is most of the CNCF. So most of those projects are related or running on Kubernetes. So if that's the area you're focusing on, then the first 10 minutes of this, honestly, is one of the best things out there. I almost wish that they would they would have a separate one that you could just go sort of rapid fire through the 10 minutes of the first of each episode and call it like Kubernetes podcast, just the news. Because that way when you're in your car, because what I'll do is if I'm not interested, like specifically not interested yet in open feature, but I am interested in the news in the first part of this episode, so I might just listen to the first part and then skip to the next one. So that's a really good way, I think. It's rapid fire, and then they have links in the show notes. So, for example, like in here, they had just a few news pieces this week, but there are always links inside the show notes. So that's a good one, I think. I was going to say, I appreciate you considering me, but we don't normally do news on this show, right? Like I'm not normally talking about all the latest releases of the week. So I don't even feel like I'm a good source of all that stuff. gRPC Web, Conrad's talking about Traffic v3. You want to build an HTTP forward proxy that supports HTTP Connect. Any pointers? Does anyone else have pointers? I do not. I don't know about the connect verb actually, so I'm just gonna have to learn about it. That's a new verb for me. I'm a little rusty on my HTTP verbs, so Anton's asking about air-gapped containers, sub-volume mounts from latest Docker update. The volume mounts I can talk about quickly. Basically, there were limitations in your ability to mount a volume and then mount other parts of that volume. And one of the things that might happen there is where you maybe want, and this is kind of related to a couple of things. One is where you want to have certain parts of a volume be read-only, or you might mount something read-only inside something that's not read-only. Basically, I even haven't really experienced this complexity, mostly due to the fact that when we design our mounts with the systems that I work with, we don't really want, if we can at all avoid it, we don't want complexity in our volumes and our mounts. So we tend to be very basic, very restrictive, and the applications have to get redesigned if they want things like a bunch of pods connected to the same mount, or two different containers in the same pod mounted to the same volume at different locations, or maybe one has read and one has read write. Like those sort of advanced examples are something that I try to avoid with teams because it never really goes well long term. Like the complexity is too great, and I try to get them to simplify the app code so that we're not relying on volume so much for those higher complexities. But if you go to the Docker release notes, what we're talking about here, for those of you that maybe aren't aware what we're talking about, so add subpath field to the volume options, making it possible to mount a subpath of a volume. So, and then there's a couple of ways you have to do it. And then I thought I read something. There's some stuff also going on with mounts and volumes in Kubernetes, not specifically related to this, but they are similar. I think I even talked about that in the newsletter with Kubernetes, and there's a new PV type and other stuff going on in Kubernetes land. So what I did, make it possible to mount subdirectory of a named volume. I'm not sure why you'd want to do this, but symlinks are supported, but they cannot escape the base volume directory. On Linux, all subpath components are opened with openat relative to the base volume directory and checked against the volume escape. The final file descriptor is mounted from the proc self fd to a temporary mount owned by the daemon and then passed to the underlying container runtime. Temporary mount point is removed after the container is started. And yeah, I have literally never needed to do this. So that's mostly because I usually will just change. For example, if I need two containers to mount the same named volume, they're going to mount it at the same location. I'm not looking to mount it at a different location. If the application needs to, like, let's say, here's a great example, maybe not such a great example, but an example I can think of. I've got a Drupal site. In Drupal or WordPress or any other blog or CMS system, you're going to have different mounts. We're going to have one for themes, one for plugins, one for the database, right? Like you've got these different mounts that you typically will need. And if I need to maybe like update a theme through a separate container that's maybe a sidecar or a separate container in that pod that maybe is going to install a new theme, or maybe I'm going to run a backup command or something like that, and I need to get in, but I don't want to exec into that container. So I'm starting a new container. I'm going to mount those volumes so I can access them, but I'm going to mount them at the same location in the path that the main container mounts at. So I've never even tried to mount it at a different location or needed to, because I'll just change my scripts or my tools to find the right location. So anyway, that's this feature. You're asking also about air-gapped containers. I'm not familiar with a new feature about air-gapped. Is that something you're asking me about in this new? Yeah, there's no mention of the word air in here. So yeah, tell me your specific needs on air-gapped containers, because we can talk about that. And like, what is your issue with air-gapped containers? Why doesn't it just work for you? Obviously, you can't do a Docker pull if you're air-gapped, but you have Docker import, and you have Docker load and save, Docker import, export. Those commands help you get images on and off machines through USB drives or however else you are going to get your images onto your container servers. So let me know your specific question, and I'm happy to help you with the air-gapped stuff. I am not aware of an air-gapped feature in the new version, so help me out if there's something in there about that. All right. Ooh, Martin's throwing in his knowledge there. Oh, yeah. Kubernetes just the news would be amazing. I don't want to listen to interviews. I'm aware my strategy has flaws. I don't want someone to tell me what I'm doing wrong. Yeah. All right. So good conversation about the Connect. I am not savvy, so I'm going to move on. So let me get back really quick to just covering this stuff. All right. Ways I get updated on news for projects that I care about there's 3, maybe 4 main ways I do this, and it does not include RSS readers. Only because I have had to sort of give up on RSS readers for years and years and years, kind of like storing a bunch of bookmarks in your browser. I also had Feedly as an RSS reader, but I would never read it. Like I would go in there and it would be like, I felt like I was emptying out my inbox, right? I felt like it was another inbox that I had to go through. And then like most of the things I just don't care about at this moment. And so I'm looking for really important news, but I've unfortunately signed up for way too many newsletters, and everyone sends too much news. So that's the real challenge. Honestly, a lot of times I really just want change logs and basically feature releases and what's changing in a lot of the tools. I'd love for those to also include optional links to maybe someone talking about them and like why those PRs exist, because I a lot of times need to understand the why of a feature, not just, oh, this new option exists in the command line. Well, I don't understand why I would need that. So it's always nice to read a blog article on it. So the first thing I do is I immediately go to the GitHub repo and I sign up for releases. So if you didn't know about this, it's not necessarily a new feature, but let's just go find our repo, right? So the way I know about Moby releases isn't by a new version of Docker Desktop. I go in here, and inside of every repository in GitHub, once you're signed in, you can go over here. Okay, that's not the right one. They keep changing these drop downs. Get that a little zoomed in. Under the watch here. Okay, here we go. Used to be a little bit higher, but under this watch, you'll see that I have set it up for custom. And I'm saying I only want to know about releases. So I get an email when there's a new release of Moby. It's just the release. I do unfortunately get minor and patch releases, but that also helps me know about security updates, or, hey, I need to go patch my systems because Docker patched a vulnerability like they did recently. Here's a good example. If I scroll down, I can't scroll because I clicked on that specific release. But if I scroll down, they just had one recently, CVE. There we go. So like 2602 was a lot about this particular CVE that was in Docker. So they fixed it, and then I got an email about that. And I just get this text, right? So if you're not doing that on the projects you really, really care about, I honestly, when I'm working with a project, like let's say a project with a company, and I'm being paid to maintain this stuff, I will go and find every tool that is something that is a major tool in that ecosystem, like in that orchestration. So if it's Kubernetes plus Argo plus Containerd plus maybe I'm putting Rancher on top of it, maybe I've got a couple of other things that I've added and installed, Valero for backups, some other tools, I will go to every single one of those open source projects and subscribe to releases, because I want to be the first one, honestly, in my team to know if there's a security update. How else are you going to know unless you sign up for newsletters and stuff? Open source projects aren't always great at sending out newsletters or having a blog dedicated to releases. In fact, if I was to go to Docker's blog, they do talk about releases, but that's only like 2% of the time. So I need to know about security updates. The other thing, obviously, I can do is if this project is actually for GitHub Actions, which I have a lot of. I have 4 or 5 Docker GitHub Actions. I have a lot of those actions, and those actions get updated. So one of the ways that you can find out about some of the things you're doing in your code, as well as dependencies, GitHub Actions, all these things that are in your repo, is you just sign up for everything in Dependabot. So if you went and looked at something like, let's see, github.com, and I'm going to think of one that I have that's going to have a bunch of examples. So this one, GitHub Actions for Docker, I've signed up for Dependabot, right? So I have this little Dependabot YAML in my repo in the .github directory, and I'm saying, hey, in this repo, I just want updates to my GitHub Actions. But what that's going to do is that's going to give me an automatic PR, which sends me an email for every minor or major update to, you can see Dependabot, right? So I can see all these dependency updates. So then I don't have to go subscribe to, for example, the CodeQL action, or Peter Evans, who makes a lot of great GitHub Actions. Peter Evans, I use one of those in here, and he did a major update from 3 to 4. Dependabot notified me that there's an update. So that's not the same thing as releases, but if it's a GitHub action or it's a code dependency and you've enabled Dependabot, I rely on those emails. So if I showed you my inbox is going to have at the bottom a bunch of, like, maybe a month old, maybe even 2 months old if it's a personal hobby project and I just don't care as much, of all these different Dependabot updates. And I won't delete it from my inbox until I've actually gone in and accepted the PR. So those kind of are hand in hand, but those are the first way. The second way here is get Google Alerts for blog URLs. So if maybe it's not an open source piece of software. Sorry, maybe it's not an open source project on GitHub. Maybe it's commercial software like Docker Desktop, or I'm trying to think of another one. And that's about it for commercial software that doesn't have an open source repo. Docker Desktop is quasi open source. There's a part of it that's closed source. So if I'm going to do that, I might go to docker.com blog. Now, I could traditionally put this in an RSS feed, right? But if I'm not using an RSS reader anymore, or I could maybe use Zapier to scan this and throw it into an email for me, or that with a Zap or some other if this then that thing. So what I will probably do is find some sort of way to filter down to really just, because they have some filters here, some categories. I'll find that URL and I'll say, okay, I'm only going to I only want to know about new blog entries on here, but I'm not using an RSS reader, and maybe I don't want to pay for Zapier or if this and that. Well, the thing that I still do, and I can't believe this still works, and I can't believe Google hasn't killed it, but I go over to google.com/alerts. And you can sign up to basically get an email when something changes. And usually it's just a web search. Like, anybody on the internet who mentions bretfisher.com, I'm going to get an email about. And I can say the frequency of the email. I can say only show me, once a week. But you don't have to actually give it a query. You can just say, send me an email for anything. And you can use a regular Google query here. So I'm going to use site : and then a URL. And then it shows me, product. These are pages. And then I'm going to create a new alert. And I can have all these different options like, only show it at most once a week, only send me one email a week, only the best results, I'm giving it as a very specific URL. So a lot of this doesn't pertain to that. But once I create this alert, then I'll get an email that highlights in it anything that's changed on that day or week that I specify. And you can see I have a bunch. If we go back, we scroll back. You can see I have a bunch there about my name, my courses. But if you see, I'm even looking for myself on YouTube and looking for myself on Hacker News and stuff like that on different sites. And basically any of my brand names, any of my trainings. But you can see here, I want to see Mirantis's blog, right? I want to see blog entries that they send out. So I just do this, and I will get an email every time they send out a blog post. That's a way for me to actually get blog post updates that without basically giving the company my email address and signing up for their newsletter. So I do that. Ben's like, yeah. Now that Google's told, now that you start using it, they're going to sunset alert. I'm actually surprised it's still there. And if it goes away, I'm sure there's going to be other services that show up to do it. But that is the second way. And then the third way I kind of already mentioned. Google's Kubernetes podcast is great. Just listen to the first 10 minutes if you don't want to listen to the interviews, which are also great, especially if you care about that topic. But if you just want to know about project updates and product releases that relate to Kubernetes, like if AWS releases a new feature for EKS, they'll have that in the first 10 minutes of the show. They even tell you a little bit about it depending on the update. Those are my three things. So I'm curious what else you do. Right? We've established that RSS readers are a thing still. You can totally do that. But yeah, my real hack there is just the Google alerts on a specific URL. And I'm trying to think, there's actually a tool out there. There's something else I'm forgetting, and I'll remember it later. But I'm just curious if anybody has any other techniques that I might learn on how to get updates. Yeah, Anton's back. Okay. Airgapped. New beta features in DD 429. Eric's up on the latest, and I am not. Regarding Airgap, I need to restrict network access for a specific container to a specific resource in a local network. Looks like Airgapped are the way to go. Possible cons. Network access for a specific container. So Anton, I'm wondering if that container, so yeah, like Eric's question, compose variant mostly, we use it for local infrastructure deployments. Need to restrict network access for a specific container to a specific resource in a local network. So do you need to actually have something on your local machine that protects that local container, or do you need it on the server itself to only allow access from a particular container? Like which end of this is where you need to protect? I don't get that request very often, so that's actually something rather unique. And the 429 beta. I'm going to look that up. Because I don't know about that. Airgap containers. Our beta release of air-gapped containers update to enhancing security with Docker Desktop's new air-gapped containers. Docker Desktop's latest beta feature, air-gapped containers, is now available in version 4.29, reflecting our deep investment in security enhancements. This business subscription feature empowers administrators to limit container access to network resources, tightening security across containers applications by restricting network access, ensuring containers communicate only with approved sources. Approved sources or approved destinations? I'm a little confused there. Customizing proxy rules, allowing detailed control over container traffic, and enhanced data protection, preventing unauthorized data transfer in and out of containers. The introduction of air-gapped containers is part of our broader effort to make Docker Desktop not just a development tool, but even more secure development environment. We're excited about the potential use this feature holds for enhancing security protocols and simplifying the management of sensitive data. Whew. That's a lot. So that's it. And I don't understand it. I don't understand how it works. Is this trying to keep my container from going out and where it can go on my network from my local machine going out? Or is this meant to like protect things coming into my container in a Docker network? I'm very confused. Maybe it's both. Keywords, business subscription. Yes. So you need to be paying for Docker Desktop to use this. Yeah, sources is such a weird term to use there. I don't, it feels like it was written maybe by someone who's more on the marketing side, that's on the engineering side, but that's what happens, right? Let's see who wrote this. Do we know this person? Vanessa. I don't know Vanessa. Yeah. So we're going to have to definitely figure this out because it sounds interesting, sounds useful, especially for Anton. I read this as a paid tier desktop only thing, but it's, yeah, that sounds exactly like what this is. And let me see if I can start. I'm going to start my Docker and see what it looks like in there. Am I even on? I am on 429. And features in development. Let's see if we can. Let's see if we can share this on the screen. We don't want VS Code. We want a different window. Okay. Got it. WASM. That's not new. Host networking. I don't see it. 429 beta feature. Wait, am I not signed in? Is that part of the problem? No, I'm signed in. I'm on business. I'm on business subscription. Give me my advanced networking. I don't see it. I don't see it. Was there a screenshot? Features in development, host networking. I'm going to have to give up. I don't know. No, I don't have to scroll. There's no scrolling here. I can't scroll down. I'm on the latest. Network. Use a more efficient kernel networking path for UDP. May not be compatible with VPNs. That's different. I've not seen that one. Yeah. Maybe, is it a part of the enhanced container isolation? I don't know. Maybe there's not a GUI for it yet, and it's just like some sort of thing I put in a file config. It would be so nice if there was a link here so I could go read about it. All right. Gonna give up on that. Somebody tell me if you got good info. Participation in beta releases is by invitation or via use of clearly identified beta features in product. Beta invitations may be private. Yeah. Good quote. Good quote. Nothing good, just ideas. Nice. All right. So, yeah. So, new feature that I don't understand and that I can't figure out. It happens. All right. So, next week, just a reminder, next week on the show, we've got Graviton. AWS Graviton next week. So if you're interested at all in ARM architecture, if you're interested in how AWS is building out their own chips and how much cheaper and how much, or if you can look at it as they're cheaper instances, or you can look at it as you can spend the same amount of money and get way more networking, probably way faster CPUs. I don't actually know about Graviton with GPUs. That's a good question. We'll have to save that one for next week. But AWS Graviton is going to be the topic for next week's show. Michael Fisher is going to be here from AWS. Nirmal will be back, my co-host, and we're going to talk all about ARM64 inside of AWS and what's here today. Hopefully we get a little news on what's next. I don't know if we'll get that or not, but I can try and ask those questions. But I'm excited about ARM on all the clouds. And obviously, a lot of us that have Macs, we're all on ARM now, the Apple Silicon variant of the ARM instruction set. And my experience with Graviton and AWS has been great. It's been very low cost. Often they'll have 10 gigabit Ethernet, which if you have ever run really cheap instances on AWS, those cheaper instances have really crappy networking. Very, very slow. So like if you're someone who's a Swarm or a Kubernetes orchestrator manager, you never want those cheap instances because the traffic going back and forth on the Raft algorithm for your control plane, there's a lot of chatter that goes there and it needs to be fast. It can't be high latency. It can't be something that takes a couple of, partial seconds even to get there. And you want at least gigabit networking, if not faster. And I love Graviton for that because it tends to have way better networking than the same cost Intel or AMD chip. So we're going to have them on the show, and then we're going to have continue.dev on May 16th. If you've not heard about continue.dev, here we go. It is essentially a VS Code plugin as well as JetBrains that is like GitHub Copilot, but is not. They're basically, I'm not sure exactly what's behind the scenes, but obviously it's some sort of, maybe it's an open source LLM that they're just adding into a VS Code plugin. I'm not really sure how all that works, but we're going to find out. So we're going to have one of the founders on the show. What else? We are going to do, let's see. We're going to have the Slim Toolkit on the show. So if you don't know about the Slim Toolkit, we're going to have Kyle on the show, the founder of the Slim Toolkit, also used to be called Docker Slim. And there's some new stuff going on that we're going to show off on the show that it can help you understand your images, shrink your images, take stuff out of your images that doesn't need to be there. We're going to do all that on the show. And then there's a whole bunch of other shows coming. MLOps, we talked about that. We're going to have Traffic on about 3.0, Traffic's big release of 3.0. So stay tuned with the show. Sign up for the newsletter. Join us in the Discord. Do all those things. And I'll see you next time. Next time I'm going to have people here. It won't be just me. But thanks for being here, everyone. And I will see you next week here on YouTube Live. Ciao, everybody.